welcome to our garden club. So we do this every Saturday from 10 until about 11:30 a.m. through the fall and the winter time. In the springtime, we switch over to Thursday evenings. But it's a great chance to get together and just talk about garden stuff. Kind of, I guess, dream a little bit, because as things wind down somewhat outdoors, we can get together and think about next year and think about what worked out really well and what inspires us. So even though we're having a fun, big special event today, this is something we do every Saturday at Sage Garden. You don't have to register, just come down and enjoy it. So today's theme is all about growing herbs indoors, which is a really lovely way to keep summer happening. And ever since I was a little kid, I've loved growing herbs and often had them indoors, just because a lot of times herb plants can actually work really well indoors. But over the years, you really get to know the ones that do easily indoors and the ones that just totally pout as soon as you bring them indoors. So we'll sort all that out for you. One of my strategies, I guess, for talking about any kind of garden thing is to try to think about, like, so what do we have in our mind? Like, what's our big goal? Like, I want to have an incredible jungle in my house, or I want to have a productive herb garden all winter long right on my kitchen countertop, or I just really like to have a couple of aromatic plants on my workplace desk or something like that. So, like, what do we have in mind? And then we want to take that information and try to line it up with what circumstance we have around us. Like, I have an incredible sunroom that's always warm and fully sunny 4 seasons of the year. Or, this is the hard one, I have an office, there's no natural daylight, and we're encouraged to keep the lights low. Can I grow basil on my desk all winter? And it's like, oh, well, we have to work on this, right? So we want to try to take what we're thinking about in our mind, the stuff we have around us to make this work, and try to match those things up as best as possible. Because at the end of the day, there actually is a solution for any of those scenarios. So we'll dig into that. As a rule of thumb, the easiest herbs to bring indoors are definitely the ones that are warm season perennial type plants. So these would be things that are almost like akin to a tropical type plant. If you go rubber tree shopping, or if you go looking for, a new philodendron or an aloe plant for home, herbs that are similar in that way, that have that kind of all-season quality to them, those are definitely the best kinds of things. I'll show you a really good example. My favorite plant of all time is the allspice tree. So we'll take this and we'll crunch it up a little bit and we'll pass it around. If you want to sample this in action today, we have a cold apple cider with cinnamon and fresh allspice leaves inside, so you can sample that after. We'll pass this around, have a little scratch and sniff on it. I know some of you have seen this before, because I love this plant, so I get kind of obsessed by it, but a little bit of allspice for you. Any reactions? No problem. We'll pass some back. Yeah, no problem. We'll pass that back. Thank you. So allspice is a really good example of a plant that works so well indoors as a herb. It's tropical. It comes from Jamaica. It's used to growing all year round, and it keeps its leaves all year round. It has no particular need to go into any kind of dormancy, and it smells great. Like, it's such an uplifting thing to have in your indoor spaces in the wintertime. So that would be an example of an easy, inspiring indoor herb that works out so well. On the other side of things are annual type summer herbs. So these are all our favorites, like basil, dill, maybe summer savory, sweet marjoram. And those are plants that thrive when the daylight hours are really long. And of course, we might have sunny winters, but we definitely have short daylight hours in the winter months. And so it's the same reason that it's difficult to get a tomato plant to grow, excuse me, just like on a windowsill indoors. There's just not enough hours of daylight to sustain all the growth and the fruiting that would be required for some summer-oriented plants. So a lot of our favorite annual type herbs, like basil, cilantro, dill, some summer savory, marjoram, they really need to have 10 hours of intense full-on sunshine, and we just don't have that in the wintertime. So if you want to make that happen, if you want to keep those herbs going, then you might need a little bit more gear. You might even need some grow lights and things like that. So that's kind of like the spectrum of what we're going to talk about. And in the middle, there's all the Mediterranean type things that actually like a bit of a cool season. Perennial type things that actually like to be outdoors, even in Manitoba. How do we handle those? So we're going to sort of go through that whole sort of climate range and see how that can work for you indoors. I guess just out of curiosity, because there's always a couple people, has anyone ever just kept a basil plant on your windowsill and it just grew through the winter? Yeah. Did you do anything special?
No, it found when I started it later in the year,
yeah,
it lasted longer, but it's still by the end of the winter.
Yeah, so So for this gardener, so she started some basil later to bring indoors. It kind of hung out through the winter time, but by the end of the winter, it was pretty much not really happening anymore. So that's a good tip though. So if you want to start basil, it's often like, don't bring them in from outdoors, start some fresh ones. But the reason I asked the question is just that sometimes you talk to gardeners who are like, you know what, I've just got this basil that just grows and grows and just lasts every year. And I think like there's a lot of genetic variability in basil, and occasionally you have some that just have this more easygoing nature. And if you ever find one like that, I would encourage you to like take stem cuttings off of it and keep it going, because those are really good. They sometimes you drive down Corden Avenue, you see them in windowsills in Italian restaurants, and it's like, wow, that is really happening. And another example would be, we have folks who come from all over the world and they're really inspired by the herbs that they're used to in other parts of the world. There's a kind of basil called Tulsi basil. Has anyone ever grown that before? That's the sacred basil. That one, sometimes we have people come in and they bring like a little bonsai of their Tulsi, and it's literally like a woody tree all done up like this. And Tulsi is a variety that can actually endure through the winter. But if you think about it, it's because it comes from that warm climate. It's used to growing year round in its natural setting. So it's a really big clue when we think about where these plants come from, how they grow in their natural setting, and how we can take advantage of that when we bring them indoors. Kind of a bit of like just sort of basic herb 101. So I guess I'm emphasizing maybe a lot of herbs like sunny location. Herbs, as a general rule of thumb, prefer to be in their own individual pots, especially when you bring them indoors for the winter time. A really common thing to do in the summer is to have like things like strawberry pots or like beautiful mixed herb planters. Maybe you would even mix some like veggies and herbs together. In the wintertime, for whatever reason, just maybe because you can kind of adjust them a little bit more readily, if you have them in their own individual pots, they just thrive a lot better. So that would be my tip number one, I guess, is like figure out the right varieties, but secondly, put them in their own spaces so you can kind of adjust and move things around. Herbs really like drainage as well, so you want to ensure that whatever containers you're using definitely have drainage holes. And I feel sometimes up against the creative world of like all the online stuff we see that, you know, so inspiring to us, like incredible mason jar herb gardens, really cool for a short time. Practically speaking, they have to have drainage holes. So any kind of container will do, and you can still have so much fun with this. You don't have to be limited to like actual nursery pots. You know, people plant up old boots or whatever, right? You can have fun with it, but ensure that there's good drainage in the bottom of that container, because 99% of herbs just won't thrive unless they have that for any particular length of time. A lot of people ask about terracotta versus plastic containers. And so I think that actually terracottas, I'd almost call it having a comeback. A lot of people are choosing terracotta containers. And I think the reason for that is that they often do breathe really well. They have natural drainage holes in them, but they also breathe really, really nicely. So that allows for good air circulation in your root space, and that's very healthy for your plants. And terracotta really lends itself to kind of an aesthetic look that's kind of nice, right? It's just got a simplicity, and it matches really well with herbs and a lot of other kind of pretty indoor plants you might want to grow. So a lot of people are choosing terracotta lately, but that's not to say you couldn't use a nice plastic container that has drainage holes in it. A big theme from the nursery suppliers these days is they actually don't punch the drainage holes out. They mark them, and then they leave it up to the gardener to decide if they want to put drainage holes or not. I would definitely put the drainage holes. Even this one has like a self-watering kind of mechanism and has a false bottom, so it separates the roots from the water. For herbs, it's really essential that you have very good drainage, and I would probably still punch out the drainage holes for 99% of herbs. In terms of the size of container too, you want to make sure that the plant, remembering our initial thought of like, what's our vision for this? If you want to have a nice big herb, give it some nice big space. But if you want to have like a cute little windowsill garden, probably the minimum size would be about a 6 or an 8-inch container. That allows it to be really productive. So whether it's terracotta, whether it's something you found around home, could be like a beautiful, you know, like a tin, you know, kitchen appliance or something like that. As long as you punch holes into it, it's going to work well. Give your plants a little bit of space. They'll grow bigger for it. And you also want to make it work, because windowsills usually aren't even this deep. So if they're going to be on a windowsill, you got to figure all these sort of things out when you're planning. But to have productivity, you want to have about a minimum of 6 inches of space and maybe about 5 to 6 inches of depth. So that works really, really well. All right, so when you're planning all this out, what I would do is I would go home and I would kind of assess how bright it is wherever you want to grow your herbs. And then I would also think about the temperature, because that's kind of a less observable kind of a variable. We often think warmer is better in general for herbs, but in fact some herbs actually prefer to have a bit of a cooler situation in the wintertime. And so again, we want to think about the natural climate for these plants. So if it's a plant that really comes from a warm location like the allspice, where it's always warm, then that's the perfect thing for like a bedroom or like a studio or somewhere where it's just going to be the cozy part of your house. But a lot of the Mediterranean type herbs, things like especially say like I have a lavender plant here. Lavender is something that's nice to grow indoors depending on the variety. We'll talk about that more in depth. But it comes from a Mediterranean climate, which is in the winter months it's not warm, it's not really cold, but it's in the middle. But at nighttime it can be like 4 or 5 degrees in the Mediterranean. And so some of the plants that we really like to grow that are herbs actually appreciate that cooler location in your place. So think about that a little bit. If it's more of a Mediterranean type herb, maybe that big bay window that you feel chilly around and you want to put like a blanket over you when you're reading a book next to it, that would be a great spot for your Mediterranean type herbs. Things like myrtle. Has anyone ever grown myrtle plants before? What can you tell us about myrtle? You love it. Awesome. So her myrtle loves her east window. It loves being indoors. It loves to be pruned. You can really sculpt your myrtle plants. Has anyone ever like smelt or tasted or done anything with a myrtle plant before? I'll pass it around. So feel free. Kind of the golden rule at Sage Garden is like scratch and sniff. So you can get in there and you can break plants off and you can nibble if you want. But I'm going to pass this one around and everyone can do this if you want. The plant won't mind. Just kind of break off a little leaf. It has this lovely, almost like bay leaf kind of aroma to it. So it's really a kind of a warm kind of aroma that can be used for cooking as well. But a lot of people grow them because they're just pretty to prune up and they get little flowers, little berries that can be eaten. And they're used a lot in wedding traditions, especially in Eastern Europe. We had someone come by recently who needed myrtle for a wedding garland crown for the bride and a boutonniere for the groom. And it's used in traditions like that. So break off a little leaf and we'll pass that one around. It's called German myrtle. Rosemary, so thyme, like all those kind of classic Mediterranean herbs, they like that kind of cooler situation, but they still need to be bright. So if it warms up during the day because it's nice and sunny and you feel cozy during the day, the cat sleeps right by that window, that's the right spot for them. But then at nighttime, if you have to kind of put your blanket on to stay nice and cozy, that's even better. It makes a big difference to those Mediterranean ones to have that contrast between summer and winter. If you decide you wanted to grow annual type herbs like basil and parsley, actually not parsley so much, but basil and dill and marjoram and those kinds of things. So those also need to be warm. I said earlier, they're very summer oriented. And to make those thrive, you're probably gonna need to set up some little grow lights. There's gonna be a little bit more gear involved in that setup, but they like to be in a warm location. So anything that's inclined towards being a summer kind of a herb or veggie needs to have a warm location indoors. So brightness is important. The temperature is equally important. So you want to sort of assess these things when you're planning your indoor spaces out. Now, I'm imagining that a lot of you have herbs that you want to bring indoors. Is that fair? Like people have stuff that's been outside in the summer, you want to bring it inside? One of the things that's really important about that in my experience is the timing. And so if we wait until like after that first frost, like I'm not talking about the one we had this week, but like when we've had real frost that actually like dies back your tomatoes, that sends a strong signal to a lot of these plants to really wind down. And even though a lot of the herbs will look perfectly good after a big frost, in fact, if you do like to post things online and you like to take photos, like sage and thyme plants, they look so beautiful after they've had frost. And when they have it all over their leaves, it's incredible. And then as the sun warms them up, they just turn back to normal. But when you bring those plants back indoors after they've had that big frost experience, or even a prolonged stretch of cool nighttime temperature like we've had the last couple of weeks, it really sends a signal to the plant to actually kind of wind down. It says, like, let's go and rest for the winter time. Whereas when you're bringing them indoors, really what you're thinking about doing is actually kind of winding things up for them again. You want them to keep actively growing, I'm assuming. So it's better if you bring these things in earlier. So we kind of have to mark on the calendar to remind ourselves to do this. Maybe even like Labor Day would be a really, really good time to do this. And it's kind of hard because summer is still in full force. We're kind of soaking in that last little bit of summer. But from your plant's perspective, that transition indoors, the stress that's associated with changing from one environment to the other is significantly reduced by bringing plants in earlier. So given that it's September 30th, and maybe we haven't brought our plants in yet, there's a couple things we can do to help plants that have maybe started to kind of wind down a little bit and they're going to come into this indoor space. So I'll demonstrate a couple of them. So the first thing is, and I'd love to do this even if I was doing this Labor Day, but let's say even now, even Labor Day, whatever, give them a little haircut. What we're looking to do is we want these plants to be stimulated to have new growth that is really only known indoors, so that they get adjusted more easily and they don't go through that transitional stress that plants can experience. So what you want to do is get a nice pair of scissors, and you're just going to lock into the very tips of the plants, and you're going to just snip off the tops. So when you think about this, it's the way we harvest our herbs all the time. Like, this is how we get them to grow bushier and bigger and fuller. So the same thing applies, and I'm kind of wasting this by putting it on the ground, but you could be taking this Mexican TERRAGON, which is it's actually a surprising herb. It's almost like it's good for desserts. The best thing I've ever had with Mexican TERRAGON was there's a local restaurant here called the Fusion Grill, and they served up this incredible apple pie with vanilla ice cream. Of course, we're already off to a good start with that. But then they finally chopped the Mexican TERRAGON on top of it, and it was like this perfect combination. It was incredible. So I'll pass this around, and you can taste this after. But chop the tips off, and so everywhere you chop it, it's going to grow new branches. The new branches will have only known new growth indoors. And most importantly, from the plant's perspective, it's almost like an antidote to the fact that things are winding down. It's like stimulating the plant. It sends it actually a hormonal signal to want to grow new stuff. And that's really helpful at this time of the year. So you want to inspire the plants to keep on going, not encourage them to go into dormancy. So, and don't be shy with this. You can go and you snip it all back. Plants like the myrtle that we passed around there, they look so much better. 2 weeks later, all kinds of new growth is coming on. You feel like, yeah, this is going to go well. Versus sometimes you just bring them in, they start to kind of lose leaves, they start to kind of brown out, they're drying out, yet you've got the soil still feeling moist, you feel discouraged. This is one antidote to that. So I'm going to pass this around. I'm going to pass it around with the scissors, and if you want to give it a little snip just to practice that. So you want to lock in where the leaves intersect from the main stems, and just allow the stuff to, you can keep your Mexican TERRAGON if you want, or you let it grow on the ground, but you just want to notice that there's like little baby leaves. They're very, very small at this point in time, just at that intersection point, and those become the new branches. And the scissors kind of lock into that location. And that's how you want to harvest your herbs in general, but at this time of the year, that's going to keep them going. So I'll pass them around if you feel like doing some trimming. There we go. You can taste the Mexican TERRAGON. I would encourage people to try that herb. It's very under recognized, I guess you could say. People often haven't heard of it, yet it's so good, and it's a plant that actually thrives indoors. So it's a really, really good option for an indoor herb. It's technically a marigold, so it's kind of hide that fact. People don't want to eat marigolds that often, but it's a delicious marigold, and it comes from Texas and sort of Mexico region, and there it's used to growing, of course, on a year-round basis. So it's a great plant to have indoors. All right, so timing is important. Snipping the plants back is important. Another thing that I really like to do at this time of the year is actually repot my plants. And when you read up on this, there's some debate, and I find it, the counter argument to what I'm about to say, I find really illogical, because our goal here is to make the plants move indoors and kind of be stimulated to grow. Some people say if you repot them at this time of the year, it causes them to want to grow too much. And I just don't get that, because if anything, we want these plants to kind of just come indoors and be productive, especially when it comes to herbs. But basically, when you're repotting things, you're kind of messing up the roots, you're giving them some new soil, and that's very stimulating for plants. Just as we prune the tops back on them, when you open them up and you kind of break open the roots, give them a new space, they grow new root branches and they become bigger and better in the root zone, and that supports top growth on the plant. So it's a really ideal time of the year from my experience to repot your plants. So I'm just going to do a little demo here. Let's see. So I've got a sage plant here, a golden sage. So usually by the end of the summer, this is obviously in a small nursery pot, but by the end of the summer, if you have herbs you've grown in pots, or maybe even if you're digging from the garden, the roots have grown a lot. And if you just kind of leave them like that, after a while, the roots just become kind of bunched up, and they become so much less effective at taking up water and also absorbing nutrients. And after a while, it can be stressful for the plant, and then it becomes stressful for you as the gardener, because you're like, why is my plant not holding water? Or I'm feeding it, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything, or various other things that go wrong. So at this time of the year, if you take it out, and a lovely weekend like this, you can go on your deck and make a bit of a mess, just break open the roots. Really, you want to hear a little crack? See if we can capture the crack. Yeah, so do that. And it's the same as pruning on the top. Every time you break those roots a little bit, they grow new root branches and they become bigger and better. And the best thing for a plant is to have a very strong, healthy root system. If everything's going well below the soil line, things go really well on top of the soil line. So don't be shy with that. Really mess them up. If you have a plant you've been growing for a number of years and it's gotten this big and you just can't fathom repotting it again, you can actually take it out of its container and you can actually remove about 1/3 of the root system. Repot it, put some nice fresh soil in there, and the plant is way better for it. So if you ever feel nervous about these kind of things, sometimes if you come here, like, we'll just do this with you. Like, you can, yeah, the first couple times you're doing it, like, you feel so terrible, like ripping your plant apart and like, is he crazy? The plant's gonna die. But no, it's really, really good for your plant. And so this is gonna invigorate the plant. It's gonna allow it to wanna grow as opposed to wanting to wind down. And that's really key to our success here. Aha, so that's a really interesting question. So what if we just transplant this from the outdoor garden and we bring it indoors? So it's not been growing in a pot all summer, but it's coming from the garden. So in that type of situation, it's actually, we have to mark our calendar even earlier in an ideal world, because the plants do need a period of adjustment to get set up in their new containers. So I would say even like towards the end of August, I would try to dig these up and get them settled into their new spots. If that hasn't happened already, no problem, we can live with this. Dig them up. So this upcoming week, we do have some cold weather. So if we knew that there was gonna be some cold weather, maybe we'd throw a blanket over them or something like that, but let them adjust outdoors for maybe a week or two in their new container to allow them to not experience too many shocks all at once, because it is a bit of a thing to get ripped out of the garden, go into a new pot. So if we could give them up to 2 weeks of time to settle into their new container, that'd be really, really helpful. Second thing would be, try to gather up as much of the root system as you can as you dig it up. So use a nice big implement to try to really get in around the root system and allow it to be full. However, if it's like a giant plant, sometimes you can kind of shake off a lot of the soil that's existing on it. So sometimes, for example, we plant figs in the outdoor garden, and when we dig up a fig tree, it's just like massive. Like, there's so much soil attached to it. And so in that case, we actually sort of tap off a lot of that soil and it just falls away. And then when we put it back into a container, it's sort of squeezing back into a bit of a tighter spot, but they don't mind that. It's okay. You just put some nice soil around them. So basically what I'm saying, if the soil easily falls off, then it's no worries. You can just let it fall off and it might be good. So let it settle in, repot it as sort of big as you can. And then if you can transition it, like say if you have like an unheated porch or something like that, so pot to unheated porch to indoors. So give it a few sort of steps along the way. Ideally, like maybe a couple of weeks in each of those locations as it moves indoors. Yeah, does that answer your question? Aha, so the question is, do you trim the roots? So if it's a really, really, really big rooted thing, I would say no problem. Go ahead and trim up some of the root system. You can normally trim up about 1/3 of the root system without any kind of ill effects. The only exception to this would be if you have a herb of some kind or other kind of plant that has like a taproot coming down the middle. Figs actually have that. So thinking back to my example of digging the figs out of the garden. So they have a lot of diffuse roots as well, but they have a big taproot in the middle. And if you happen to cut through that, very bad for your plants. So kind of feel it out a little bit. You'll see it. Like if there's a big, huge root right in the middle and there's not a lot of sort of fibrous roots all around it, then just be more cautious. But if it's a very fibrous rooted thing like the sage there and it's just got lots of bunched up roots, you can prune up a 1/3 of the roots easily. Yeah, no problem. So yeah, so timing is important. Transition them, get them settled into their containers, prune off the tops. Another question that comes up is what kind of soil to use for all of this? And herbs, they like that drainage, as we said earlier. So we use a potting mix that we add compost to. So we use a potting mix that has peat moss, perlite, those little white grains that allow it to have aeration. And then we add about 1/3 compost to that. Here we use the sea soil compost a lot. It's made out of fish and bark, and it's really, really nice for your plants. And it builds a lot of nutrients in there, so you don't have to worry about fertilizing as often. It really nourishes the plant right from the start. And that takes a lot of the pressure off you as a gardener to have to worry about doing too many things. So get that compost in there. If you have good quality home compost, awesome, that would work too. So if it smells good and you don't see fruit flies coming out of it, then into your pot, about 1/3. And then that really helps the plants out a lot. One of the things I've observed over the years, and it's kind of striking actually, because I get to see a lot of plants, and actually sometimes people bring me plants to see and they send me photos all the time. And I sort of feel a little bit bad talking about this, but sometimes plants look better than others. And so I've often asked myself, like, why are some people's plants just better looking than others? And so I try to inquire in gentle ways. And so one of the things I've really noticed, and it relates back to our own practice of how we do things here, when compost is a key ingredient in the soil, the plants generally look better. Like, it's just they're not as stressed, they're fuller, they're lush, they do their thing. So I would say ample compost is always going to be very beneficial, and don't be shy with it. If you have your own home compost, that works great. Something like the sea soil is beautiful just because it has a lot of nitrogen in it that comes from the fish, which you won't get in your home compost, and it's also very much consistent. So we use it a lot. But yeah, mix that in. Another thing you can do in this line of thinking is you don't necessarily have to repot your plants. I mean, if they're big enough, if they're doing well, you've got a happy container for them, but you can certainly top dress them. So in other words, you can just add compost to the top of the soil. Such an easy thing to do, and it really just builds in that kind of soil fertility, that soil ecology. Hey, how are you doing? Right on, I'm good. So jump right in. So these guys are from CBC, yeah? So yeah, don't be shy with the compost. It's very, very beneficial to your plants. All right, so we gotta do some fine tuning here. So there's some little things, and I'm gonna need my scissors back. So where have the scissors ended up? Right on. If someone wouldn't mind passing them to the front, that'd be great. So any questions in what I've said so far? For sure, it's there's lots of lots of things I've said, I guess, and we'll check back on the video that we're doing. And then on our website, we have a lot of blog information, and because these are common themes, these are certainly things that are posted there. At Garden Club, we can come back and we can revisit topics as well. And so we try to have lots of resources available to you, so check those out. But I'm going to show you some other cool things. So if you have very leafy kinds of herbs, like mint, and this is a lemon balm, these are things that are actually pretty winter hardy in our climate, and they're almost like the trickiest ones when you bring them indoors, because you'd think they would be happy to come in for the winter, like we're happy to go in the winter. But on the other hand, these are plants that are very well adapted to our cold climates, and they do that by noticing that fall has come and they go into dormancy. So we have to trick them a little bit more than the other plants to keep them actively growing. So in this case here, we have to give them like a serious haircut. So does anyone have any fine scissor handling skills? You could come up and demo this with me? Jared. Would anyone like to come and trim up this lemon balm plant? It's going to be dramatic and it's going to be fun. You will be on camera. Okay, come on up. Right on. And this is another one. You can practice this at Sage Garden anytime you want. We'll find you a plant to do this. Okay. What's your name again?
Rob.
Hey, Rob. Right on. Okay. So the lemon balm plant has to be cut back 100%. So as we bring it indoors, it's not a little fine tuning. It's just like this is a serious cutback. And the plants that like this are all your leafy herbs. So this will be like your mint, your parsley, lemon balm, French tarragon, anything that's kind of a leafy herb, especially if it tends to do well outdoors in our climate. So Rob, you're going to get in there and you're just going to cut it right to the ground. Okay? Let's face Jared here, and you can show him exactly what you're doing. Right to the ground, yeah. And so what this does for the plant is it really encourages new growth, but in a very significant way. Like it's really telling the plant we gotta step it up here. Okay, cool. So yeah, our plant is now like just short like this. And sometimes with a mint plant, thank you very much. You look pretty calm about that, by the way. Is all good? Yeah. Sometimes people are like trembling. They're like, oh no, I can't do this. So yeah, a mint plant, you might not even see any leaves after you cut it back. It might be completely cut to the base, and that's okay. You'll notice with a lot of these kind of minty style plants, this one doesn't quite show it, but if you look at a mint plant, it'll often have big thick roots just under the soil line, and those are just waiting to grow up into new stuff. So be very confident about cutting back your leafy herbs. It really benefits them. So yeah.
So Dave,
Yeah.
cutting it back like that, because I have a big mint outside.
Sure.
And I'm nervous now seeing that.
Oh, no.
Anyway,
Yes.
Once you cut it back, do you just immediately bring it in, or do you leave it out there for a bit? Or?
Okay. Yeah, so the question is, so you have this in the garden and you're thinking about bringing it indoors.
Yeah.
So, and it's now, like it's September 30th. So I would cut it back, put it in a pot, let it sit for a bit to adjust to the pot. You know, in this case, it's a slightly different situation than, say, like a rosemary or like a fig tree that you're bringing in, because in this case, the plant is going to be kind of, it's almost semi-dormant already. Like it's sort of noticing that fall is really here. So it's going to have less shock anyways if you cut it way back and you bring it indoors. So I'd say there's less need for a waiting period. You could just cut it back, put it in a new pot, bring it in, and water it and do all the nice things, and it's going to start to regrow. So yeah, you'll notice an advantage of the situation is that like you cut away so much of the growth, you're not going to like sadly lose it. Like when the leaves sort of drop later on, it's just going to be done, right? You got rid of that stuff. Only new stuff is going to come on, so it'll be good. I wanted to talk about strawberries, which are not strictly speaking a herb, but there's kind of an ever-bearing strawberry revolution. Has anyone ever noticed you can go to a farmer's market now and you can actually get strawberries in like mid-September? And if anyone's been growing strawberries at home, you might notice that there's all kinds of varieties that you can harvest like all season long. Those are called ever-bearings. There's one kind that's actually it's called a day-neutral strawberry. It's called TriStar. And that one is the best kind to get because it really can produce any time of the year. But any strawberry variety that's labeled as an ever-bearing type can literally produce strawberries as long as they're warm enough and they have enough light and enough water and nutrients. So a lot of people are bringing strawberries indoors, and this might be a little bit like our mint plant. It's a plant that could go outdoors or it could come indoors. And so these you might need to trim up too. This is going to be even harder because we've got flowers on here. We might even have some berries on there. It's going to be sad, but but you notice like there's fall colors happening here, and that's a clue. This plant, this leaf is not going to kind of suddenly come back into its glory. So what I would probably do is I would go ahead and I would trim up all that big stuff once again. And in this case here, I would leave the flowers on because they have the good potential to become new strawberries. But I would trim off anything that's looking obviously like it's aware that it's fall. And I would bring that indoors. We have a customer who actually has a heated garage. Heated garages, by the way, are awesome for winter growing because you can keep them a little bit cooler. And a lot of these things don't need necessarily like 25 degrees, but like maybe if we can keep it at 15 and they'll produce. And so he has like eaves troughing that he's got on a zigzag on his wall. And he's got these ever-bearing strawberries growing on it, and he has lights, and he eats strawberries all winter long. It's pretty satisfying, right? So, so our theme here is talking about herbs, but there's other kinds of interesting edible stuff that you could bring indoors. So I just thought I'd mention ever-bearing strawberries are a very fun one, and it's extremely satisfying when it's January and you're able to harvest a fresh strawberry off a bright windowsill or from under lights in your garage or somewhere like that. But same principles apply here. Cut away any of the kind of obviously fall colors type stuff. Bring it indoors, all will be well. Okay, so that's that. And what else did I want to show you? All right. Hot peppers. This is kind of another area where kind of relates to herbs too. And hot peppers can really work well indoors. Our hot pepper people, Don and Barb, who are just over here with their spice mixes, they grow about 120 different kinds of pepper plants. And some of them are large fruited, some are small fruited, some of them are like ridiculously hot, but they make these incredible blends. And I think they keep some of their plants indoors through the winter. I know that we have lots of customers who do, and especially when it comes to things like the ghost peppers, and this is a little Mexican pepper called, so bad at pronouncing things, but Boquino iracema, whatever that means. These are little, if you ever go to like Louisiana or Texas, they have these little almost like cherry tomato-like peppers. They're kind of becoming famous because, you know, everyone talks about their travel adventures and eating, but they look like cherry tomatoes, but they're kind of a spicy pepper that's not too hot and they're full of flavor. The rule of thumb with peppers would be the smaller fruited the plant or smaller fruited the pepper fruits, the more easily they transition to indoors. And the advantage of keeping them year to year is simply that they become almost like a shrub and they fruit so much earlier, and they might even fruit right through the whole winter. So this would be another kind of an interesting one to bring indoors. Peppers need a lot of warmth basically and a lot of sunshine. So this would be for your bright sunny sunroom, and they need a little bit more space than your average herb. So you'd put them in a bigger pot, but that's something you could absolutely keep going through the winter months as long as it's warm, as long as you have some space for them. If it's warm enough and it's bright enough, you can actually have these fruits all year. And another advantage is sometimes the long maturing varieties like ghost peppers, they almost, depending on when you started them or when you got them in the summer, they might not quite ripen if you just left them outside. So by bringing them indoors, you get that sort of season extending opportunity to have them be harvestable. So that's kind of a fun one. And let's quickly show you here. These would be some things that would be on that I was talking earlier about how Sometimes certain plants are just like well suited as herbal indoor houseplants, sort of like our regular things like rubber trees and such. So I've got a few examples. This is a ginger plant. Probably some of you have grown this before, the galangal ginger. Has anyone had success with that or tried it? Okay, so it's another scratch and sniff. We'll pass it around. It's a ginger that comes from Thailand, and both the roots and the leaves are edible. And so you can break off a leaf. The leaves almost have like a lemony ginger kind of aroma to them. So yeah, so crunch open the leaf. It's got like a lemony ginger. You can make like chai tea out of it, and you can simmer it. You can make marinades. You could cook rice with it. But it's such an exceptional house plant. It could work as a decor plant. So thinking about my rant against like all the things that look beautiful online that don't work, this one can actually work really well in beautiful little pots. It gets almost a bamboo-like look to it, and you can actually harvest the roots off of it without killing the plant. You just take a piece off, you put everything else back in, it keeps on growing. So I'll pass this around, and you can break it open a little bit, check out the aroma on it. So that's called galangal ginger.
How about the light for that ginger?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the light requirements for the ginger? Very low light. In fact, you can grow this almost in a north window, in an east window for sure, even if it's not a bright one. If it's in a sunny window, it's fine too. So it's very versatile. And so I'm glad you asked that question. There's so few herbs that actually thrive in lower light situations. This is one that thrives in low light situations. When you think about tropicals, sometimes tropicals have that advantage because they are often understory plants. So the ones we would grow at home don't by nature grow very tall. And so they're used to having things growing up over top of them. And that makes them better suited as tropical houseplants, just like the normal things we would grow. It's called a camphor tree. And I really like collecting plants, and so I always look for things that are a bit unusual. But when you crunch this one up, it's loaded with camphor, and it's actually where commercial camphor comes from. So when you're making or when you're getting Vicks VapoRub, this is where it starts. And I like this for the winter simply because you can actually use this. You can take the leaves, you could steam with them, and you could inhale that camphor just to smell them. It's very refreshing. And as the plant gets bigger on a warm day, it just smells good in a room. Like you would just smell that aroma without being like obnoxiously medicinal. It just smells really fresh. It's a relative of a cinnamon tree too, and they're very beautiful, kind of like handsome plants. And it almost reminds me as an interesting alternative to like the classic ficus that you would have in an office or in a house situation. It sort of has the same kind of growth style. So I'm always intrigued when people, when they like the kind of exotic plants, because when you have someone come into your space and you have these aromatic sort of living aromatherapy examples around, people often ask you about them. And I think that's really exciting in the winter if someone comes over to your place and they're like, oh, that's a nice plant, what is it? And it's like, oh, it's a camphor tree and it smells so good. And then you chat about that. It's very engaging. So I like to experiment with these things. And some of the most exotic plants make for the most easygoing house plants. So I'll pass this one around. You can break it open.
So is this low light as well?
Okay, so the question is the camphor plant low light? It's more light than the galangal ginger, but it's not really, really needy that way. So it doesn't have to have like the most sunshine. Another one that people really like, yeah. Sure, so the question is, how big does the camphor tree get? So the camphor tree, so if we went to a tropical climate, camphor trees get like huge. My dad travels a lot for his work and he goes to China often, and he's gone through camphor forests, and he says the trees are kind of like, not quite like redwood size, but they're very large, and it just smells incredible. Like like everything smells like camphor in the air in a very refreshing kind of way. So I can't wait to go. But this is my way of recreating that. But at home, I'd say a lot of those kind of tropical tree-ish type things, like the allspice, cinnamon trees, camphor trees, they'll kind of grow as big as whatever space you actually have for them. And that's limited usually by your ceiling and the containers you have. Yeah. So it could grow like 10 feet tall if you had the space. But if you want to keep it shorter, you just bonsai it. You just chop the top. It can stay 2 feet tall if you want. Yeah. Yes. So the question is, could we take these kind of things outside for the summer months and then bring them back in for the winter? Absolutely. So I really like to have these as patio plants. I think the plants gain a lot of vitality through the outdoor season if they're summering outside. So I would definitely do that for sure.
So when I bring it back in, do I have to repot it?
Okay. Sure. So the question is, if you've sent this out for the summertime, do we have to repot it when we bring it indoors? Well, I do like to repot, but it's not required necessarily. And you might get to a point, and there's some around here that they just get so big after a while, like we can't even manage to move them anymore. So if you're kind of hitting the upper limits of your ability to move your plants around, at that point you just are root pruning, top dressing, they're fine at that point in time. But if it's a smaller plant and you have the capacity to upsize it, I think it's always beneficial for the plants, for sure. Yes? Okay, so the all pesky problem of bugs. So pests are one of the worst things. When it comes to indoor plants, it really kind of takes the fun out of it when you're overwhelmed by plants that have a lot of bugs on them. So one of the first steps towards not having bugs on your plants is to actually literally shower them. So this would be like to go out with a garden hose if it's still nice enough outside, or it could be literally in your shower at home, and just rinse them with fast flowing fresh water. It's such an easy way to brush off 99% of the pests that could occur. It works so well for aphids, for spider mites, any of the soft-bodied insects that aren't necessarily fully adhered to your plant, but kind of hang out, especially in the upper foliage on the plants. And you want to try to focus on like the upper growth, because most of those pests will be just on the undersides of the upper leaves. And so literally like take the shower or the hose nozzle and just kind of like really go at it, like really hit them hard, and that'll knock those pests away. It works really well. And it's a good thing to do even like through the winter months. If you were to repeat this every so often, it really helps to keep plants, you know, I'd say pest free. Like if you do this on a regular basis, you can really grow plants pest free with no other interventions. There's a couple other things you can do though, and I think about this a lot because we grow things organically here, so we don't use any of the conventional chemicals that would normally be like the arsenal, like the full-on attack, just to like blast everything away. So we have to think about things a little bit differently, but yet we have to be very attentive to this. And there's a few new kinds of tools that have become available for commercial growers that unfortunately aren't available for retail use. One of the new ones that we're using, and is so effective and is so easy to use, is it's a canola oil-based spray. And it's something that's like, there's what are called dormant oils. Dormant oils are things that you put on your trees outdoors in the fall and in the late winter, and that kills off outdoor pests. And you can only do that with dormant oil when the plant has no leaves on it. Now there's new ones that are called like in-leaf kind of oils, right? So that when the plant's actually growing. So unfortunately not registered for home use, but it's something that we can use at the greenhouse, and we've been finding like so effective against some of the annoying pests like scale insects or mealybugs, which can really get into the bark and such. So that's been a new tool for us, but unfortunately not available for home gardeners yet. However, for home gardeners, if you actually have pests on the plants, something like Safer's End-All is probably your best actual intervention with an insecticide, simply because it has the oily, naturally kind of oily stuff, and it also has something called pyrethrum in it, which is very effective at killing off the adult, egg, and nymph stages, so all 3 stages of the life cycle of your common soft-bodied pests, and it's very safe to use. It's not very safe for birds and for fish, so you wouldn't spray this if you have a bird cage over here or a fish tank over here. But otherwise, for mammals, it's very safe to be applied, and can be used on food crops right up to the time you harvest them. There's no particular restrictions on this particular product. So if you actually had pests and you were rinsing and nothing was changing, then I would say this would be your next step. But between the rinsing and the time the plants come in and getting to here, there's a couple of other things you can do. One of them is just actually make sure your plants have nice soil. There's so much evidence that having like a good, healthy living soil that has the beneficial bacteria and fungus and all the good stuff that's in a healthy living soil, the enzymes, if you have that in the soil, there's concrete scientific evidence about how that prevents pests in the rest of your plants. This partly has to do with causing the plant to grow in a slow but steady way, as opposed to the really quick kind of rapid growth that comes from using Miracle-Gro, such chemical type fertilizers, which cause rapid, fast growth. If you use a compost-based approach to fertilizing, then the plants grow in a more steady way, and it's much less appealing to a lot of your soft-bodied insects. Other things you can do, just tidy up around your plants. This is something that I always have to remind myself to do at home, but every so often I get out the vacuum cleaner, I kind of clean up all the debris that's around the plants if there has been some leaf drop. I take some soapy water and I wipe the rims of my plants, like around the containers. I will just kind of wash where I have them set. I'll wash the saucers that are below the plants, because a lot of time pests will kind of like find their way into those little nooks and crannies where they're kind of hidden away. And then they come out when the plants are more vulnerable, like when it's January, February, and maybe the plants have been a little bit stressed by the forced air heating or because there's been less daylight. And that's when the pests show up. So pests can be really annoying, but there's like a bunch of simple things you can do to kind of stay ahead of that curve for sure. The last thing I'll say about that is that Probably our biggest challenge in our climate is our forced air heating, because that really dries the air out and it blasts the leaves with this kind of drying forced air that some pests like spider mites really thrive in that situation. So if you can deflect the forced air away from your plants, or if you can put little dishes of water near the plants to improve the humidity around them, that can make a tremendous difference. So just two more things I wanted to share, and then I'll answer any questions people might have. So one of them is, when it comes to your plants in the wintertime, I've mentioned that if you build that compost right into the growing medium, then your plants are going to be thriving and they're going to have a lot less need for intervention on your part. But some plants are a little bit needier in terms of fertilizer. So if you're growing something that's kind of a fast growing plant, like a mint plant, and you're cutting it back and it's growing up, you're cutting it back, you might need to apply some supplemental fertilizer through the winter. So you can use a liquid compost-based fertilizer. I know, like in the past, people had a lot of anxiety about if you apply the little blue bottle or a little green bottle of drops, you can overdo that. And you can kind of undermine your plant's well-being by over-applying fertilizer. Well, the nice thing is, with the organic fertilizers, you really can't do that. You could put the whole bottle on and things will be fine. The plant is a waste, but the plant is actively taking those nutrients out of the soil. They're not just being sucked up like a straw. And so the plant will not take up extra nutrients. They'll just be in the pot and it'll be kind of silly, but the plant won't be overwhelmed by the nutrients in the way they would be with a soluble chemical type fertilizer. So you can very confidently apply these fertilizers even in the winter months, when I think we've been kind of educated to think about not fertilizing. But I strongly encourage you to fertilize a bit, whether it's build the compost into the soil or apply a supplemental fertilizer. If you have very kind of like tropical things like the camphor tree or like the allspice, a very easy approach is to use the organic fertilizer spikes. You just put these in every 3 months and just mark it on your calendar. So it's just 4 times a year. It's so easy. So if your goal is low maintenance, this is an excellent way to go, especially if you have larger kind of more like houseplanty type things. Doesn't apply just for herbs. You could use this on your your beautiful rubber tree or your like incredible philodendron or whatever it is. And so it has a little chart, tells you how many to put in based on the container size, but it works really, really well. And it's an organic solution. The last thing I'll just quickly chat about is if you did want to grow some of those plants that require lots of daylight, a lot of people are getting supplemental lighting these days. And the technology has advanced so much in terms of the quality of the light, the efficiency of the light, and the cost of the actual hardware. So I think for anywhere from $10 to $100, you can get a nice grow light setup, and you can really make a difference if you want to grow any of the summertime type things like basil. You know, a lot of people like to have basil in the winter. Just get some grow lights. Basically, what's important about grow lights is that they have to be full spectrum, and this is measured in what are called Kelvin units. So we want to look for 6,400 kelvins, and it'll say right on the packaging. I know when you go to a hardware store these days, there's a lot of LED lighting, and a lot of it is described as kind of like daylight lighting, but the spectrum is not what plants need. It has to say 6,400 kelvin. So for the most part, you're not going to find that at a regular store. You have to go to somewhere that has specialty lighting, and you want to know that you're getting 6,400 kelvin full spectrum lights. And LED lights have become much more affordable lately. So a lot of people are using LEDs because they're very cool, they're super efficient, and they last a really, really, really long time. The price is still probably 3.5 times higher than fluorescent lighting. So if you're sort of debating those two things out, there's nothing wrong with the high efficiency fluorescent lighting either. It's really good, and the cost to get into it is so much less still than LED lighting. So at this point in time, some people are just kind of converting as they've kind of outgrown their old operation or whatever if they're adding lights. But that said, T5 lights, the fluorescent lights are awesome as well. And for between you can get, I don't have an example here. I feel kind of nervous now. I don't have an example here, but you can get the screw-in CFL full spectrum lights. They cost about $10. You could get a 2-foot full spectrum light for $35, a 4-foot one for $40. So it's not very expensive. The cost of operation is really, really low, and it completely transforms your experience of growing those summery-oriented herbs. So a well worthwhile topic. We could have a whole garden club about that, so we'll chat further another time. But have I given you some ideas for bringing your herbs indoors? Okay. Are there any other questions people came today having that I could answer for you? Yes. Sure. Yeah, so the question is the soil mix that I suggested for herbs earlier. So I said about 30% compost. And then the bulk of that, like the other 70%, what we use is just a peat-based potting mix. So in other words, it's peat moss, perlite, has some lime in it to help balance out the pH of the peat moss. But it's basically a standard potting mix mixed with compost at a 30-70 ratio. Yeah. The point of it is that it drains really well. Yes?
I was going to ask about the perennials, if you could like separate some of them to bring in.
Sure.
How you would do that.
So the question is about perennials, and you're wondering about perennial herbs or just any kind of perennials?
Well, for instance, chives. If you could take
Sure.
a piece of chives and have that inside.
Okay, so the question is, so say you're bringing something like a chive indoors. You have it in your garden, you want to bring it inside. And there's lots of perennial herbs, like there's, TERRAGON and like the lemon balm mints. Or some of the oregano varieties are perennial outdoors. So yeah, so when you bring in the perennial type herbs, they're going to be a little bit less inclined to want to grow just because they want to have that dormant period. So that's why that chopping back really, really helps. A few perennial herbs are very evergreen though, and so chives are actually quite an evergreen plants. Thyme would be another example. So the thyme varieties that last outdoors through the winter, you can go dig under the snow and you can harvest thyme, right? Like you just bring it in, it thaws, and then it's ready to go. So they're a little bit different because they're happy outdoors, they're happy indoors, they're easygoing. So chive, you just move it inside, probably keep it in a bit of a cooler location and it'll be happier. But your leafier type perennials that die back to the ground, like lemon balm and mint and tarragon, they need that heavy cutting back. So that's where you'd get out the scissors and you'd really like plan to make some herbal vinegars or something that day because you're going to cut like a lot.
So how do you manage time?
Sure, so I'll answer the thyme question, then I know you have a question too. So how do you grow thyme indoors? Thyme is a bit fickle. It needs to have a bright location and has to have really good drainage. So thyme is actually a really appropriate plant for the terracotta pot that just breathes extra well. And so I would say a terracotta pot, maybe about a 6 or an 8 inch pot. But the thing I find difficult with thyme is you have to water it a little bit more carefully than some varieties. So with that, you're going to water it deeply. So you know the water has gone from the top to the bottom of the container. And then you're going to allow it to dry out just a little bit between the waterings. And this is kind of actually a good rule of thumb for all of this stuff. So it dries out a bit between the waterings, but maybe with time, you're not going to let it dry out quite as much because then the needles start to turn yellow when they drop off. So if you're noticing that the needles are turning yellow and dropping off your thyme plant indoors, it means it needs a little bit more water. So yeah, you had a question.
Where would sage fall on that? Is that one that would be cut right back?
All right, so when it comes to sage, what would you do with it? So sages come in a pretty broad array of styles. So there's like the very leafy ones, like the pineapple sages, which get big and they're full of very leafy growth. The sages, like this little one that I chopped back earlier, this is more like a garden type sage. And it's actually kind of woody. So the top growth is fairly flexible, but the nature of the stems is to be woody. And so any of the sages that have that woody type stem, and this would be true for your thyme. If you're bringing rosemary indoors, it'd be the same idea. You don't want to cut deep into that old wood because it takes forever for it to regrow. So stick more to the tops, and you could cut maybe a third of the top. So you could apply the same rule of thumb as you would for the roots of your plant. So yeah, trim the tops back, but don't cut off those very woody stems. Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Two questions about the ginger.
Sure.
The first one is how to tell when to harvest the roots.
Yeah.
And the other one is since the leaves are so different than something like a mint, how do you tell how to prune those or when?
Okay. Yeah, two really interesting questions. So when it comes to the ginger, I talked about harvesting the roots. So how do you know when it's actually ready to harvest? So ginger does take a little while to mature. So I'd say it might have to settle in for even like a year or something like that in your place to develop a nice big root system. And it's going to develop a bigger root system the warmer it is. So after a while, I just kind of dig around. I might like kind of pull it out of the pot, lay it out on a sheet where I can make a bit of a mess, like some paper or something. And then I just kind of look. And you'll notice, even I think in the pot that went around, you'll notice some like sort of pinker kind of little tips coming up. That's a clue that there's larger pieces of ginger just under that. And so you can kind of take a sharp pair of scissors, cut into it, and you'll be able to pull it off and you'll see like a pretty good piece of ginger there. It's not going to look like grocery store ginger, like especially the galangal has more of a pinkish root and it's more tender looking. It's not like that kind of tan colored, leathery kind of coating or whatever. It's more fresh looking. So it looks a little bit different. But once you feel like you can pull out some substantial pieces, then you're good to go. When it comes to harvesting the ginger, like you pointed out that the leaves are not like alternating the way that a mint plant or something would be. So in that case here, you're giving it, actually, let's see if I can find another example. Can I borrow the ginger plant again? Where has it ended up? Is it the back? Would you mind bringing us the ginger plant, please? Thank you so much. Hey, Don. This is our hot pepper guru, Don. Him and his wife grow how many varieties? Thank you.
Lost count already.
100 and...
This year there was 105 plants in the garden.
Yeah, 105 plants, incredible. So if you guys have hot pepper questions after, Don and Barb are the people to talk to just over here. They have samples of their product, it's very, very good. And they grow it all right here in St. Vital. So when it comes to a ginger plant, you can actually trim down, so follow the whole stem down to its base, and then you can cut it down there. And it's just gonna keep on growing new shoots that come up from the bottom like that. It reminds me a little bit of, this is an unusual plant. This is called a pandan plant. Has anyone ever cooked with pandan? It's kind of like a South Asian herb. It's used a lot in Indonesian and Filipino and Thai cooking. Goes really, really well with coconuts. So anything coconut curry, even dessert flavored coconut stuff. And that one too, because the leaves kind of grow out from the middle, what you do is you harvest the outer leaves first, and then it keeps on growing new ones. So yeah, good point. It's not always just a shear across the top. Sometimes you go from the bottom up. Yeah, cool. Any other questions? Yes.
Where does oregano fit into the shear it off or
For sure. Okay, so the question is, what about oregano? And actually, when you asked that question, I thought you might be asking, where does it fit into in terms of its, what part of the house it might grow in? Like, is it warm climate, cooler climate? And so I'll answer that first, because no, I want to, like, yeah, exactly. The part B is really important. A lot of herbs, you'll notice that you can't just apply one rule of thumb to like every kind of oregano or every kind of mint or every kind of lemon balm or whatever it is, because a lot of times there's different varieties that come naturally from different parts of the world. So if you wanted to grow an oregano plant and you wanted to grow it well indoors, there's some varieties that come from really warm climates. Like we have one called a Cretian oregano that comes from a Greek island, the island of Crete, and it's really warm there all the time and it thrives indoors. Whereas your Greek oregano, which is a really popular outdoor one, it grows in the mountains of Greece and it's used to cold winters, and that one really is better out in the outdoor garden. And you'll notice that the more warm climate ones tend to have woodier growth on them, and so that would be more like you trim the tops, whereas the hardier kind of oregano would be more like cut it right down. The golden oregano there, that one, cut it right down. Yeah, so just kind of feel the stems. If they feel very leafy, then just cut it down. But if you sense that kind of woody growth and there's like, that's dominant, then you really have to pay more attention, yeah. Really appreciate you being here today. Join us for Garden Club next week. There's a little handout inside that has the whole list of Garden Club topics now through December. You can find it on our website as well. So thank you. Really appreciate you being here.